I had just come home from hip replacement surgery when I asked my daughter for help. My legs shook as I tried to steady myself in the chair, the stitches pulling with every breath. Instead of helping, she looked at me coldly and snapped, "We are not your servants." Her husband smirked as if my pain was a nuisance, not a reminder of everything I had sacrificed to give them this house. That single moment told me more about their true hearts than years of pretending ever had. And it set me on the path to reclaim everything they thought I was too weak to fight for. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments, what would you do if your own child looked you in the eye and called you a burden when you needed the most? I reached the front steps with the careful shuffle of a man who trusted his legs less than the stitches holding his hip together. The ride home from the hospital had left my bones sore and my body weak. But I told myself that stepping inside would bring comfort. The faint smell of coffee and lemon cleaner drifted from the kitchen. And for one foolish moment, I believed I would be cared for by the people who had promised to look after me. I lowered myself into the chair by the window. The movement pulled at my hip until heat flared down my side. Still, I kept my voice steady. "Laura, could you bring me a glass of water, please?" She turned from the counter. Her face was set, cold, the kind of look someone gives when they want to end a conversation before it starts. Her answer landed like a slap. "We are not your servants." The words rang through the room, louder than any shout. Mark did not even turn his head from the television. He smirked and said, "You can walk. The doctor said walking is good for you." Their indifference stung deeper than the pain in my body. I thought of the bright lights in surgery, the shaking in my hands when I signed the consent papers. The silence when I woke to hear the bleeding had been worse than expected. The surgeon told me not to climb stairs, not to strain, not to push myself. And yet, here in the house I had bought for my daughter and her husband, they could not spare me even the smallest kindness. I pushed myself upright, the chair groaning as I stood. Pain stabbed across my hip and down my leg, but I steadied myself and moved toward the kitchen. My cane clicked against the floorboards with each step. Laura shifted out of the way, but did not move to help. Her arms were crossed, her eyes hard. Mark laughed at something on the screen. The counter was cool beneath my hand as I filled a glass at the sink. The water was ordinary, the same water I had tasted for years. Yet it seemed bitter now. It carried the weight of what I had just lost. I turned to face them. Laura dug through the bags she had just carried in, bags I had paid for. Mark flicked through channels, his attention fixed on strangers on a screen. I was standing there, trembling, and they acted as if I were invisible. I carried the glass back to my chair and sat slowly, every muscle protesting. I thought of nights when Laura was young and sick, when I sat by her bed with wet cloths and whispered stories until she drifted off. I thought of Ruth, my wife, who used to remind me that family meant sacrifice. After her death, I sold Miller's Hardware, the shop I had built with my hands, so that Laura and Mark could live in this house. I remembered the day I signed the deed. Laura had cried against my chest, whispering, "Dad, this is too much." Mark had shaken my hand firmly and promised, "You will always have a place here." Now, years later, I was holding a glass of water that felt heavier than stone. My daughter brushed past me with her perfume trailing the air and muttered, "You should not exaggerate, Dad." Mark rose for a beer, glancing at me as if I were an unwelcome guest. Their words and their faces made the memories of that promise burn like fire in my chest. Anger tightened in me, sharp and metallic. but something colder came with it. A memory, quiet but steady, surfaced. Robert Hayes, the lawyer who handled the papers after Ruth's funeral, had insisted on adding protections to the deed. He had told me not to sign anything without them. I had been too lost in grief to think much about it. But now, as I sat with the glass empty on the table, I realized what those protections might mean. I fixed my eyes on Laura until she looked away. The silence grew heavy. My hip ached and my body shook, but inside me a calm began to take shape. I leaned back into the chair, felt the stitches stretch across my skin, and whispered so low they could not hear. This house may still be mine. They have no idea. I sat in the fading light with those words echoing in my chest. The glass of water on the table no longer felt like a defeat. It felt like a reminder. I had built more than one life from nothing before. I could do it again if I had to. My hip throbbed as I shifted in the chair. But pain was an old companion, one I knew how to endure. What hurt most was the look in my daughter's eyes, the same eyes Ruth once swore mirrored mine. There had been no trace of love in them today, only annoyance. The silence in the room pressed against me until I could hardly breathe. I let my mind slip backward, away from the bitterness, into the years when work was my anchor. Miller's Hardware had been my life for nearly 4 decades. It was not much at first, just a narrow store with dusty shelves and a counter I built myself from pine boards. I stocked nails, screws, paint cans, and every odd tool that could keep a household standing. Customers came because they trusted me. I fixed their problems, gave them credit when their paychecks came late, and delivered lumber in the back of my truck when no one else would. Ruth used to say the shop was my second child, and she was right. I poured myself into it, year after year, until it grew strong. But time is cruel. When Ruth got sick, the shop began to feel like a burden. She would sit behind the counter, pale but smiling, tallying receipts in her careful handwriting. I knew every long shift was cutting away at the little strength she had left. When she passed, the place became unbearable. Every corner smelled like her perfume. Every ledger line carried her neat script. I remember standing in the empty aisle one night, the fluorescent lights buzzing above me, knowing I could not spend the rest of my life surrounded by ghosts. So I sold it. A stranger signed the papers, and the shop that had been my pride became someone else's. The check cleared, and for the first time in my life, I had more money than I knew what to do with. It was not just the sale. I had put aside savings for years, scraping bits from every paycheck, telling myself Ruth and I would use it to travel once we were old enough to slow down. That dream ended with her. I sat in the quiet house, the smell of her still clinging to the curtains, staring at the bank statement with no one to share it with. Then Laura came. She and Mark had just married, their apartment small, their future uncertain. I wanted her to have something better. I wanted her to feel safe. When I saw the listing for the house on Oak Ridge Drive, I knew it was the right one. 3 bedrooms, a wide yard, a basement big enough for laughter and storage alike. The price was steep, but with the sale of the store and my savings, I could cover it. I told myself it was what Ruth would have wanted, a place where Laura could grow her family, where I could grow old without fear. The day we signed the deed is burned into my memory. Laura clutched my hand so tightly, her knuckles went white. "Dad, this is too much," she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. I shook my head and told her that family looks after family. Mark gripped my shoulder, his eyes shining with what I thought was gratitude, and said, "You'll always have a place here, no matter what." His words had felt like a promise written in stone. I let the notary's stamp echo in my chest like a blessing. For years, I lived by that belief. I gave when they asked. When their car broke down, I paid for a replacement. When Laura wanted new furniture, I covered the difference she could not afford. When Mark's job fell through, I pulled from what was left of my retirement. I did it gladly, because that is what fathers do. Gratitude filled the air in those early days. Laura hugged me after every gift. Mark shook my hand and called me the best man he knew. But gratitude, I have learned, has a short memory. As I sat in the chair now, I realized when it had changed. Gratitude had turned into expectation, and expectation had hardened into entitlement. They no longer saw me as a father who chose generosity. They saw me as a resource to drain. I remembered the way Laura laughed when she talked about redecorating, saying, "Dad can handle it. He always does." I remembered the way Mark once told his friend on the phone that he didn't have to worry about bills with the old man around. They thought of me not as someone who gave, but as someone who owed. The laughter from the television jarred me back to the present. Mark had turned the volume higher. Laura stood in the doorway, scrolling through her phone, her shoulders drawn back as if my presence were an intrusion. Their ease in this house, the house that came from my sweat and Ruth's sacrifice, stung more than the wound in my hip. They believed it was theirs, entirely and forever. I pressed a hand against my leg, forcing myself to breathe slowly. My mind began to work in the way it once had, when I managed every detail of the hardware shop. I could still picture the file cabinet in Robert Hayes' office. The man was thorough, almost stubborn in the way he insisted on legal protections. I had not understood the need then, but now I did. I closed my eyes and saw his face, serious behind thick glasses. "David, do not sign away everything without conditions. You may not need them now, but you might one day." The memory settled in my chest, like a key turning in a lock. Conditions. Safeguards. He had built them into the transfer, even when I had not cared enough to listen. If those papers were what I remembered, then I was not powerless at all. The thought steadied me. My daughter believed I had nothing left to hold over her. She believed my age and my weakness meant she could speak to me like a stranger. She had no idea the past was still waiting to be opened like a ledger with pages unturned. The sun outside dipped lower, casting long shadows across the living room. Laura sighed loudly, annoyed at some message on her phone. Mark laughed again at the television. To them, the evening was ordinary. To me, it was the moment everything shifted. I reached slowly for the small drawer in the side table, the one where I kept old letters and scraps of memory. My fingers shook, not from weakness, but from the clarity that was building inside me. Nestled among faded photographs and spare keys was a worn business card, the edges bent from years of storage. The ink was still sharp. Robert Hayes, attorney at law. I held it between my fingers as if it were a match ready to strike. The card trembled slightly in my grip, not because of my weakness, but because of the possibility it carried. Years had passed since I had last seen Robert Hayes, yet his face came back to me with the clarity of a hammer hitting steel. A steady man, deliberate in his speech, a lawyer who had never rushed me even when I wished he would. Back then I had signed the deed over to Laura and Mark in the haze of grief. But Robert had pressed his pen to the page only after laying down protections I barely understood. Now, holding his card again, I felt those protections rising from the dust of forgotten years like soldiers answering a call. I set the card on the table and breathed in silence. The television roared in the background, but I did not hear it anymore. All I could hear was Ruth's voice, faint in memory, telling me never to let go of the house unless I was certain it would keep the family together. I had broken that promise, or so I thought, but perhaps there was still time to mend it. I picked up the phone and dialed the number, half expecting it to be disconnected. It rang once, then twice, before a familiar calm voice answered. "Hayes and Associates, this is Robert." For a moment I could not speak. My throat closed with all the years between us. Then I forced the words out. "Robert, it's David Miller. I need your help." There was a pause, then a tone of recognition. "David, it has been some time. How are you holding up?" "I just came home from hip surgery," I said. "And I think I made a mistake 5 years ago. The house, the deed transfer. I need to know where I stand." Robert's tone sharpened, professional yet warm. "Do you have privacy?" I glanced toward the kitchen where Laura and Mark were laughing over something on the screen of her phone. "No," I admitted. "Not now, but I can make time." "Good. Come by my office tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Bring whatever documents you still have. We'll talk through everything." The relief that rushed through me nearly buckled my legs. "Thank you," I whispered. After I hung up, I sat back in the chair with the card resting on my lap like a talisman. My hip throbbed, but the pain seemed distant compared to the fire building inside me. I had thought myself trapped, dependent on the goodwill of people who no longer saw me as a man, but as a burden. Now I had something better than goodwill. I had law. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Laura's face as she spat those words. "We are not your servants." They echoed in the dark like a curse, but instead of weakening me, they hardened into steel. I thought of the years since Ruth's death, the gifts I had given, the sacrifices I had made. None of it mattered to Laura anymore. Gratitude had rotted into entitlement, and entitlement into disdain. But Robert had reminded me that the past still had weight. The deed was not just a gift. It was an agreement. Agreements had conditions. Conditions had teeth. By dawn, I had a plan. I would test them. I would give Laura and Mark one more chance to show they still had even a shred of decency left. If they failed, I would have the evidence I needed to take back what was mine. I rose carefully, bracing myself on the wall as I made my way into the kitchen. The smell of coffee filled the air. Laura stood at the counter scrolling her phone while Mark muttered over the sports section of the newspaper. They looked up only briefly when I entered. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Could one of you grab me a glass of water?" Laura's head snapped up, her expression shifting in an instant. Her lips curled with the same disdain I had seen the day before. Mark snorted into his mug. "You can get it yourself, Dad," Laura said. "We are not your servants." The words burned in the air like smoke that would not clear. I stood there in the kitchen, the glass in my hand trembling, my hips screaming with every heartbeat. And yet, I felt calmer than I had in years. I had asked for nothing more than kindness. What I received instead was contempt. Laura turned away from me, smirking as if her cruelty had been some kind of victory. Mark chuckled and shook his head, his eyes already drifting back to the newspaper. They had no idea that with every dismissive glance, they were only writing their own downfall. I set the glass on the counter and let the silence stretch. My breath came heavy, but my voice was steady when I finally spoke. "This is my house," I said quietly, "and you will be leaving." The words seemed to freeze them for a moment. Laura spun, eyes wide as though I had just spoken in a language she could not understand. Mark laughed first, a sharp sound without humor. "Your house?" he said, rising from his chair. "That's rich. You signed it over years ago. It belongs to us now." Laura crossed her arms, her face flushing with anger. "You can't just throw us out, Dad. We live here. You're confused because of the surgery." "I'm not confused," I replied, my voice hard as stone. "I gave you this house with conditions, and you've broken everyone. You treat me like a burden. You speak to me like I'm a stranger. That ends today." Mark stepped closer, looming over me. "You've lost it, old man. You think you can waltz in here and make demands? You don't get to dictate anything anymore." I straightened as much as my aching body would allow. My cane dug into the floor as I leaned on it, but I did not waver. "You forget who built this," I said, "who paid for every wall, every nail. I could take it all back, and I will if I must." That was when Laura's face changed from anger to something sharper. Fear. The kind of fear that comes when people realize their easy comfort may be slipping. She glanced at Mark, and in that flicker, I saw the truth. They knew I had power they did not understand. Mark must have seen it too, because his tone shifted. His voice dropped low, almost a growl. "Sit down, David. You're not thinking straight." I turned toward the hall, but before I could take a step, Mark blocked my path. He yanked the cane from my hand with one rough motion. Pain jolted through me as I stumbled, steadying myself on the wall. Laura grabbed my arm, her nails biting into my skin. "Stop this," she hissed. "You're going to make things worse." "Worse?" I said, forcing the word out. "You've already made it worse." Mark reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone before I could react. "We'll hold on to this," he said coldly. "No more crazy calls or threats. You need rest. You don't have the right," I growled, but my voice cracked. "We have every right," Laura snapped. "You're not well. You're acting irrational after surgery. We're protecting you from yourself." Her words dripped with false concern, the kind that might fool outsiders, but carried nothing but malice inside these walls. They guided me down the hall, not gently, but with firm, coordinated grips that made it clear I had no choice. My body was too weak to fight both of them. The stitches burned as they pushed me into the bedroom. Mark shoved me onto the mattress, and Laura slammed the door shut. I heard the distinct click of the lock turning from the outside. Their footsteps retreated down the hall. For a long moment, I sat there in the dim room, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. My own daughter had locked me away like a prisoner in the house I had given her. I tried the handle. It held firm. The window stood across the room, curtains stirring faintly in the evening breeze. I limped toward it, every step agony. I pushed it open and leaned out into the cool air. Below me stretched a 15-foot drop onto the concrete drive. Impossible. Not in my condition. Not with these stitches holding my hip together by thread. But just beyond the fence, in the yard next door, a figure moved. It was Daniel Brooks, my neighbor for nearly a decade. A decent man, steady and kind, the sort who mowed his lawn every Saturday morning and always waved at the mailbox. He was coiling up a garden hose, the sunlight glinting off his glasses. I leaned out further, gripping the sill until my knuckles whitened. "Daniel," I called hoarsely. "Daniel, over here." He looked up, startled, then dropped the hose when he saw me leaning out the window. His face shifted from confusion to concern in an instant. He jogged closer to the fence. "David? What's going on?" "They locked me in," I said, my voice shaking. "Laura and Mark, they took my phone. I need you to call the police." Daniel's eyes widened. Are you serious? Dead serious, I said. Please, tell them I've been confined against my will. Tell them my daughter and her husband are keeping me locked in my own home. For a moment, Daniel just stared, processing what he had heard. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed quickly. I could hear the dispatcher's voice faintly through the speaker. 911, what is your emergency? Daniel glanced up at me. Address? 4715 Oak Ridge Drive, I said. Tell them it's a family dispute. Tell them I'm being unlawfully confined. He relayed the details with calm precision, his voice steady even as mine shook with urgency. He added that I was recovering from surgery and that my daughter had taken my phone. The dispatcher asked questions, and Daniel looked up at me for answers. I gave them as clearly as I could. Finally, Daniel ended the call and pocketed his phone. They're on their way, David. 8 to 10 minutes. Relief flooded me so strongly, I nearly collapsed against the sill. Thank you, Daniel, I said. Thank you. Don't worry, he replied firmly. I'll stay here until they arrive. From beyond the door, muffled voices drifted in. Laura and Mark were talking, though I could not make out their words. They sounded calm, almost casual, as if they believed they had already won. I backed away from the window and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. My hip throbbed, but I clung to the thought of sirens cutting through the night, of uniforms stepping across my threshold to restore order. Outside, Daniel stood watch like a sentinel. Inside, I listened to the low hum of their voices, waiting. Then, faintly, I heard it. The distant wail of sirens rising on the breeze. Hope sparked in my chest. But at the same moment, Laura's voice sharpened from the living room, rehearsing lines thick with false sweetness. Dad has been confused since the surgery. He thought the door was locked, but it wasn't. We're just trying to take care of him. The sound of tires crunching on gravel drew nearer. My heart hammered. I moved closer to the door, pressing my ear to the wood. The voices in the living room grew sharper, Laura's tone suddenly sweet, rehearsing her story for strangers. Mark chuckled as if the whole thing were a performance. They knew help was coming, and they were already preparing their lines. The doorbell rang. I heard Laura's quick footsteps, the soft squeak of hinges, and then a polite voice introducing itself. Good evening, sir. Ma'am, we had a call about a possible dispute at this address. Laura's tone shifted like a chameleon changing its skin. Officers, thank goodness you're here. My father just had major surgery. He's been so confused, saying things that aren't true. We're very worried about him. I pounded my fist against the door. Do not believe them, I shouted. They locked me in here and took my phone. For a moment, there was silence. Then Mark spoke, his voice calm and careful. He's been having these outbursts all week. The doctor said it could happen after anesthesia. We're just trying to keep him safe. He thinks the door was locked, but it sticks sometimes. You can check if you want. Keys rattled. The door opened, and two officers stepped into the hallway. A man and a woman, both in dark uniforms with steady eyes. Laura followed them in, her hand on her heart, her expression perfectly pitched with concern. Sir, the male officer said gently, can you tell us what happened? They forced me into this room, I said, my voice shaking with anger. They locked the door from the outside. They took my phone so I couldn't call for help. Laura gasped theatrically. Dad, that's not true. You left your phone on the kitchen counter. I was charging it for you, see? She held it up, screen glowing, as if the evidence were undeniable. I stared at it, stunned. That was my phone, the same one Mark had yanked from my pocket. But in Laura's hand, presented like a prop in her show, it looked like nothing more than proof of her story. The female officer glanced between us. "Sir, when did you have surgery?" "3 days ago," I said. "A hip replacement. The surgeon told me not to overstrain myself. That's why I asked for help. They refused. They mocked me. When I told them to leave the house, they locked me in." Laura shook her head, sadness etched on her face. "Dad, you're not remembering things right. We've been taking care of you since you came home. You've been a little disoriented. The pain medication can do that." "It's true," Mark added quickly. "The doctor even said he might get confused. We're just trying to follow medical advice." I turned desperately to the officers. "That's a lie." They said, "We are not your servants." They laughed at me. They treated me like I was a stranger in my own home. The male officer scribbled notes in a small pad, but his eyes told me everything. To him, I was a frail man, weak from surgery, possibly muddled from drugs, lashing out at the only family I had left. "Mr. Miller," the female officer said gently, "do you feel unsafe right now?" "Yes," I said fiercely. "As long as they are here, I am not safe." Laura's hand fluttered to her chest. "Dad, how can you say that? We love you. We just want to take care of you. Please, officers, he's not himself. He was shouting earlier, saying the house wasn't ours anymore, demanding we leave. It was heartbreaking." The words landed like daggers. She had twisted everything into a story of devotion. Her eyes even glistened with tears she could summon at will. Mark placed a protective hand on her shoulder, playing his role as the supportive son-in-law. Together, they looked like the picture of family sacrifice. The officers exchanged glances. The male officer closed his notebook. "Folks, I don't see evidence of a crime here. It seems like a misunderstanding during recovery. Mr. Miller, if you continue to feel unsafe, you can always call us again. But for now, I suggest everyone take it easy tonight." "No," I shouted. "They are lying to you. They locked me in here. They took my phone. Please listen to me." But the decision was made. The officers gave Laura a kind nod, reassured Mark with a few words, and walked out. I followed them to the threshold, but Laura was already there, hand on my arm, her face an angel mask of care. "Thank you, officers," she said sweetly. "We'll watch him closely." The door shut behind them. The sirens faded into the night. The mask dropped instantly. Laura's eyes turned cold. Mark leaned close, voice low and sharp. "That was a very stupid thing to do, old man." Laura shoved me back toward the hall. "You're lucky they didn't take you away for evaluation. Keep this up and we'll make sure they do." My legs shook as they marched me down the corridor again. The bedroom door slammed. The lock clicked. This time I heard the rattle of a key sliding into place. The room felt smaller than before, the air heavier. My heart pounded, but not from fear, from fury. I had seen what they were capable of. They had turned the truth upside down, and the world had believed them. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window. Daniel's yard was empty now. He'd gone back inside after the officers left. I was alone again. My phone, my cane, my dignity, all stripped from me. But as the minutes dragged into an hour, something hardened inside me. If I stayed, I would lose everything. If I acted, I still had a chance. I turned to the window. The drop below was steep, 15 feet to the ground, but there was a flower bed along the side wall, soft soil that might break the fall. My hip burned at the thought of the landing, but pain was a price I could pay. Freedom mattered more. I eased the window open, inch by inch. Cool night air spilled across my face. My hands trembled as I hoisted one leg over the sill, then the other. Every motion tugged at the stitches until it felt like fire was carving through my side. I gritted my teeth, refusing to give them the victory of my surrender. For a moment I perched on the edge, the house behind me glowing with the lights of betrayal. The ground below, a shadowed gamble. I whispered a silent prayer to Ruth, asking her to give me strength one more time. Then I let go. The impact knocked the breath out of me. Pain screamed through my body, exploding in my hip, my chest, my arms. For several seconds, I could not move, sprawled in the soil of the flower bed. My vision swam. I waited for the tearing of stitches, for the hot rush of blood. But the worst did not come. Slowly, with hands clawing at the dirt, I pulled myself upright. The night air felt sharper now, each breath laced with the raw taste of survival. My legs shook, but they held. I limped across the yard, hugging the wall to keep out of sight from the windows. Inside, I could hear the muffled sound of the television and Laura's laughter. They believed me beaten. They believed me contained. But they were wrong. The words pulsed in my head as I staggered around the corner of the house, one hand braced against the siding for balance. My hip throbbed, my arms shook, but fury steadied me more than any cane could. Every breath was a knife, yet the pain was nothing compared to the fire in my chest. I was not done. Not yet. I reached the front porch and crouched slowly, every joint screaming in protest. My fingers brushed beneath the welcome mat until they found the small metal edge of the spare key I had hidden 3 years earlier. A simple habit, an old precaution. Tonight, it became salvation. I slid it into the lock and turned. The door gave way with a soft click. The living room glowed with the television's dull light. Mark's laughter carried faintly from upstairs. Laura's voice floated after it, sharp and careless. They were comfortable, certain of their victory. I slipped inside like a shadow and eased the door closed behind me. The air smelled of their dinner, rich with spices I had once enjoyed. Tonight it turned my stomach. I moved slowly, each step deliberate, careful to avoid the familiar creaks of the floorboards. I had lived in this house long enough to know every sound it could betray. My goal was simple. Documents. Proof. In the bottom drawer of the cabinet in my bedroom sat copies of the deed, retirement account papers, and correspondence with Robert Hayes. If I could reach them, I would have the weapons I needed. I moved down the hall, my hand trailing lightly against the wall to steady myself. Every step was agony, but anger drove me forward. At the door to my bedroom, I paused, listening. The sounds upstairs grew fainter as the television switched channels. I turned the knob and slipped inside. The room smelled faintly of dust and old paper. The moonlight slanted through the curtains, spilling across the familiar furniture. I crossed to the cabinet and lowered myself carefully to the floor. My hips screamed in protest, but I gritted my teeth and pulled the drawer open. The papers were still there, bound neatly in a folder. My name, David Miller, stood out in heavy ink across the top of the deed copy. I ran my fingers over it, remembering the day I had signed, the day Laura's tears fell onto my sleeve as she told me it was too much. I remembered Mark's handshake, firm and promising, telling me I would always have a place here. Their words echoed now like lies carved into stone. I pulled out more papers, account statements showing withdrawals I had made for their emergencies, a replacement car, a business loan, medical bills when Laura claimed insurance would not cover them. Each page told the story of my sacrifice. Each figure was a piece of the retirement I had given away for them. I stacked them neatly, The evidence of a lifetime's worth of generosity turned into entitlement. With the documents tucked beneath my arm, I crept back toward the hall. Upstairs, footsteps crossed the floor. I froze, pressing myself against the wall. Laura laughed at something Mark said, and for a moment the sound reminded me of the little girl she had been, the one who brought me dandelions from the yard and said they were for Mom. My chest tightened. I wanted to remember her that way. But the woman upstairs was no longer that child. She had chosen cruelty. I slipped back through the living room and out the front door, closing it with care. The night air felt cleaner than the stale lies inside. I moved slowly down the porch steps, clutching the folder to my chest. Each page inside felt like a weapon I could finally wield. By dawn, I was sitting in the back of a taxi heading toward Robert Hayes's office. The streets blurred past, gray and empty in the early morning light. I clutched the folder as if it were life itself. My body ached from the escape, my stitches pulled with every breath. But my mind was sharper than it had been in years. Robert's office stood in a modest brick building downtown. I had been there only twice before, but stepping inside now felt like walking into a fortress. He met me at the door himself, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose, his suit slightly wrinkled from being called in early. "David," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "You look like you've been through hell." I placed the folder on his desk. "You have no idea," I said. "They locked me in my room, took my phone, told the police I was confused from surgery. If not for my neighbor, I might still be trapped there." Robert's expression hardened. "That is elder abuse, plain and simple. Sit down, David. Tell me everything." I lowered myself into the chair, wincing as my hips screamed. For the next half hour, I recounted every detail. Laura's words, Mark's mockery, their refusal to help, their laughter at my pain, the officers who believed their lies. Robert listened without interruption, his pen scratching across the pad in front of him. When I finished, he leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You were right to call me," he said. "The way we structured that deed, they have obligations. Failure to provide care, showing hostility, treating you as a burden, all of that triggers reversion clauses. The property can come back to you." I stared at him. "So it's possible?" "Not just possible," he said firmly. "It's likely. Courts take a dim view of ingratitude, especially when it crosses into cruelty. You have documentation, witnesses, even police involvement. They thought they could twist the truth, but those lies may actually strengthen your case. We can move fast." Hope surged in me, raw and bright. For the first time since Ruth's death, I felt like I was not alone. "What do we do?" Robert opened the folder, scanning the papers I had brought. "First, we draft a formal notice of revocation. We state that the conditions of the gift have been violated. We prepare eviction documents. Once served, they have 30 days to vacate." 30 days, I repeated, the words tasting bitter. After what they've done, they deserve less. Robert's eyes met mine. By law, that is the default. But there are ways to press harder. If you are willing to fight, we can shorten the timeline. They will not expect it, and it may shake them enough to surrender without a court battle. I sat back in the chair, the ache in my hip drowned out by the heat of determination. 30 days was the law, but Mercy had left this house long ago. The papers Robert had prepared lay heavy in my bag, each stamped and signed, carrying the authority I no longer had to beg for. As the taxi pulled up to the curb outside the house, I felt the familiar surge of tension in my chest. The siding, the windows, the porch, all of it looked the same, but it no longer felt like home. It looked like a battleground. I stepped inside without hesitation. Laura was in the kitchen, clattering dishes into the sink. Mark lounged at the dining table, scrolling on his phone. Both looked up, startled, when they saw me standing straighter than before. My cane firm in my hand, my bag over my shoulder. "Laura, Mark," I said evenly, "come into the living room. We need to talk." Laura rolled her eyes. "Dad, not this again. We don't have time for—" "This is not a request," I cut in, my tone sharper than she had ever heard from me. "It's time." Something in my voice must have pierced them, because Mark set his phone down and followed, suspicion written across his face. Laura trailed behind, her arms crossed, her chin raised as though already preparing for battle. I placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it slowly, deliberately. Their eyes followed the movement, curiosity mixed with unease. I pulled out the first document and slid it toward them. The paper bore Robert Hayes' letterhead in bold print. "What is this?" Laura asked, her voice already wavering. "An eviction notice," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You have 72 hours to remove yourselves and all your belongings from my property." The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Laura's coffee mug slipped from her hand and clattered onto the table, cold liquid spreading across the wood. Mark stared, his lips moving soundlessly before he finally found his voice. "You're joking," he said, forcing a laugh. "This is some kind of scare tactic. You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted. "And I have. The deed transfer was conditional. You failed those conditions the moment you treated me like a burden instead of a father. You locked me in a bedroom. You lied to the police. You mocked my recovery. The law does not call that family. The law calls that breach." Laura's face drained of color. She sank onto the couch, staring at the papers as though they were in a language she could not read. "Dad," she whispered, "you wouldn't do this. You can't." "I already have," I said. Mark shoved his chair back, pacing the floor, his fists clenched. "This is insane. You're going to throw us out on the street? Where are we supposed to go?" "That," I said coldly, "is not my concern anymore." Laura burst into tears, her hands covering her face. For a moment she looked like the little girl who once clung to me after nightmares. But the memory faded quickly. Her tears now were not for me. They were for herself, for the comfort slipping from her hands. "You think this house means nothing to me?" I asked, my voice rising for the first time. "I built Miller's Hardware from the ground up. I worked there until my back bent and my hands cracked. I sold it after your mother died, sold every memory and sacrifice I had built with her, so you could have this place. I poured my life into this house. It cost me my future. And this is how you repay me? By treating me like an intruder in my own home?" Mark stopped pacing. His bravado cracked, replaced by something closer to panic. "We made mistakes. We were stressed. You just had surgery. We weren't ourselves." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You were exactly yourselves. Surgery did not make you cruel. Surgery did not make you greedy. That came from choices, your choices. And choices have consequences." Laura lifted her tear-streaked face. "Dad, please, we can fix this. We can change." I leaned across the table and slid the eviction notice closer until it touched her trembling hands. "You had your chance. Now you have 72 hours. The room was silent except for Laura's ragged sobs and the steady tick of the wall clock. I stood, my cane firm against the floor, and walked toward the hall. Behind me, Laura's voice broke through the quiet, small and desperate. "Dad," she cried, "where will we go?" I did not turn back. My voice was colder than stone. That's not my concern anymore. The words hung in the air like the toll of a heavy bell, echoing into every corner of the house. Laura's sobs filled the silence, but I did not turn back. I walked down the hall with my cane striking the floor in deliberate rhythm. Each step felt stronger than the last, as though the house itself recognized my claim had been restored. For the next 2 days, the house became a place of cardboard boxes, whispered arguments, and muffled weeping. I sat in my recliner, the same chair where I had once felt like a prisoner, and watched them move about like shadows in a place that no longer belonged to them. Mark avoided my eyes. His shoulders slumped, the swagger gone. Laura moved carefully, as though each step on the floor was borrowed. On the first night, I heard them upstairs whispering through the thin walls. Laura's voice cracked. "We can't leave. We have nowhere." Mark muttered something about friends, about temporary arrangements, but even he sounded defeated. I lay awake listening, the ache in my hip sharp but steady, like a reminder that I had survived worse pain than this. By the second morning, the house looked different. Suitcases lined the entryway, boxes stacked by the door. The life they had built here in 5 years was reduced to taped cardboard and broken promises. I did not help. I did not offer comfort. I simply watched, silent, letting the weight of consequence settle around them. At one point, Laura approached me. Her face was pale, her eyes ringed with red. She clutched a small photo frame of Ruth and me, the one that had sat on the mantel for years. "Dad," she whispered, "I need you to know I understand now. I see what I did. I see how I failed you. And Mom. She would be ashamed of me." Her voice cracked, and for a moment I saw the little girl she used to be. But the years between us were too heavy, the damage too deep. I looked at her and said quietly, "Your mother believed this house would keep our family together. Instead, you used it to push me out. That is on you." She bit her lip, tears spilling again. She pressed the frame into my hands and walked away. Later, Mark shuffled into the living room, his face drawn and haggard. He stopped in front of me, his hands twisting together. "Mr. Miller," he said softly, "I need to apologize. I mocked you when you were in pain. I locked you in your room. I stood by while Laura disrespected you. I thought we could twist things our way, that you were too weak to fight back. I was wrong. I see that now." I nodded once. "You see it because you've lost. The lesson came too late." He lowered his head and turned back to the boxes. By afternoon, the house was stripped of their presence. The walls, once filled with their laughter and arguments, stood quiet. Only the keys remained, resting on the coffee table where I had placed the eviction notice days earlier. Laura picked them up slowly, her fingers trembling. She looked at me one last time. "Dad, will you ever forgive us?" I took the keys from her hand. They felt warm from her touch, but solid, real, like the weight of truth itself. "That is not the question you should be asking," I said calmly. "The question is whether you will remember this lesson well enough to treat the next person with the kindness you should have shown me." Her lip trembled. She nodded, and together she and Mark walked out the front door. The latch clicked softly behind them. Through the window, I watched as they loaded the last of their boxes into the car. No words were exchanged between them. Their shoulders slumped, their faces empty. They drove away from the house, shrinking down the road until they were gone. Silence fell, deep and complete. I looked around the living room, at the furniture I had bought, the walls I had paid for, the roof I had raised with sweat and sacrifice. For the first time in years, the house felt like mine again. No tension, no contempt, no burden, just me and the echoes of Ruth's memory. I sat back in my chair, the keys heavy in my palm, and breathed deeply. For the first time since the surgery, the air filled my lungs without bitterness. The weight that had pressed on my chest for years lifted. I closed my eyes and felt peace settle over me. Not the peace of revenge, but the deeper satisfaction of justice properly served and lessons properly learned. This was my house again, and I was no longer anyone's burden. If you like this story, subscribe and tell us about your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next one, click on the box on the screen.